that addiction does not discriminate. It can be anyone with an education, doesn't matter your financial status, doesn't matter really where you're from. It's all over the world. And my mind was just like, wow, like this is real life. And there are people right and in our corner that are struggling with this. So I'm really glad that whatever I wrote on that paper, I really don't remember exactly what I wrote on there, but I'm glad I ended up here. It's a true passion of mine, and it's just been a lot of fun. And this year will be 5 years that I've been doing this work. I started at 22, had no idea what I was doing, but I feel like in the last 5 years, I'm really just gained so much passion for this.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the FIO podcast. Today we have a very special guest. We have Lindsay Malhotra. Hey, Lindsay,
Hey.
thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here.
I was connected to Lindsay via Sierra, which is my editor. She's my right-hand woman. She's amazing. And they have had a past together. Lindsay, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So, thank you so much, Maddy. My name is Lindsay Malhotra, and I'm a licensed master's level social worker based out of Dallas. I'm also a chemical dependency counselor and a peer specialist supervisor. So, that's kind of like a mouthful of what I do. I'm originally from San Antonio. I'm 27, and I've been doing this work for 5 years now. So I currently have worked with pregnant women that are struggling with a substance use disorder. I'm really passionate about several things, but particularly I'm passionate about substance use and keeping families together, allowing mothers to be reunified with their children. I'm passionate about really just working with a homeless population and just educating individuals. I was explaining this to a colleague recently of that I also was not very educated prior to joining the field and prior to going to the University of Texas at Arlington for my social work degree. So I just want to educate those who are not too familiar on these important topics. So, yeah.
Thank you for that background. I would love to ask you how you got started with working with people with substance abuse and how and where that passion came from for you.
So, yeah, I'm originally from a really small town south of San Antonio. It's about like 45 minutes from the border of Mexico and Texas. In my high school, I saw a lot of, different students and individuals either just disappear. And I'd always be like, where'd they go? Are they okay? And then it turns out, as time kind of went on, I realized that it's because they started using substances. And then I would get more familiar and understand that it was in my family as well. Then I'm like, you know what? Like, I better not do that. I better go to college to help people who are getting involved in that. So then I went to the University of Texas at Arlington. I got my bachelor's and my master's in social work. And there was like a list. It was a very interesting. There was a list, right? And on the list, they were like, okay, on a scale from 1 through 10, like list where you would like to go do an internship. And I was like, oh, well, this is interesting. I'm not from the Dallas area. So I was like, oh, 1, 2, 3. I was just like naming what sounded pretty cool. And then you would like open up an envelope like a couple weeks later when they found your placement, and they sent me to Nexus Recovery Center in Dallas. And I had no idea what that was. Never heard of it. Never drove by it, nothing. So I'm like on Google, like, what is this place? And I eventually started interning here in 2018. And that's when I really found my true passion for keeping the families together and understanding that addiction does not discriminate. It can be anyone with an education, doesn't matter your financial status, doesn't matter really where you're from. It's all over the world. And my mind was just like, wow, like this is real life. And there are people right and in our corner that are struggling with this. So I'm really glad that whatever I wrote on that paper, I really don't remember exactly what I wrote on there, but I'm glad I ended up here. It's a true passion of mine, and it's just been a lot of fun. And this year will be 5 years that I've been doing this work. I started at 22, had no idea what I was doing, but I feel like in the last 5 years, I'm really just gained so much passion for this.
Wow. Was there anything that really surprised you when you started working with individuals with addiction? I know that we've, as a society, kind of create this image of who is probably addicted to something, like that, this kind of character profile of who is an addict. And when we kind of did our discovery call, I was even, humbled with the information that we were talking about. So was there anything that really surprised you when you first started working with substance abuse victims?
I think what I really think what surprised me the most was learning about the fact that it is a disease.
Mm,
And I think the reason why that kind of stood out to me is because prior I'd be like, well, why can't they just stop using? I just don't understand. Like it doesn't
mhm,
that sounds terrible. Like who would want to continue to put a needle in their arm 5 times a day? Like who wants to do that? And why can't they just stop doing that and go get some help? Like it is way beyond that. It's about family trauma, lack of resources, lack of financial assistance, childhood trauma. Maybe things happened when they were 5 years old, 6 years old, 10 years old that they're using substances to suppress that. So I think really understanding how the brain builds a tolerance to any type of substance that you're using, whatever that may look like, if it's cocaine, steroids, PCP, fentanyl, alcohol, marijuana, the brain organically builds a tolerance and it tells you, hey, I need more. That's not enough. Let's do more than yesterday. Let's do more than the day
mm,
before. And then you eventually, despite all the consequences of losing everything in your life, you keep going because the brain tells you, I need more. Um, and on top of that, I think actually witnessing people withdrawing from substances
mm.
is truly heartbreaking. I've never seen that until I started working here. And it breaks my heart. They are uncomfortable. They're sweating. It's like the flu times 10. Um, and that's because the brain has told the body, I need more, or else I will go into withdrawal. I will get sick, and I'll feel miserable if you don't give me more. And I didn't know any of that. And I was like, man, like I wish people who this is still a stigma to them can come and see this, and their minds will be completely changed.
Speaking of the stigma, I even have seen that in my own family. I've
Yeah.
got a side of my family who definitely struggle with alcoholism, and growing up, I always just looked at them like, can you just not do that? Like, that this is a problem. That this is, affecting everybody, and people don't want to be around you because you're an alcoholic. And I think as we grow up, we can see that nobody wants this. Nobody's actively seeking out addiction and saying, like, yep, that's exactly where I want to be. But we have such a stigma. Where do you think that kind of comes from?
I don't know. I think it could be a cultural thing as well. Me, I'm Hispanic, and it's definitely a cultural thing for me because we don't talk about our problems. You don't talk about if you're drinking too much. And also, alcohol is very much accepted at any party, any evening, any type of thing that in other cultures it may be a little bit different. Overall, I think that it's a stigma to reach out for help, especially when you're addicted to something. I think it could be a lot of embarrassment, a lot of shame, and it could not even be substances. It could be gambling, pornography, unhealthy relationships, your work. It could be so many different things that we get ourselves addicted to that we lose so much in our life because of that one particular thing that increases the stigma. It's like, wait, don't
Mm.
talk about it because then people are going to think of you this way, or don't tell them that much because then they'll think of you this way even more. So I think the stigma can be a lot shame related, cultural
Mm.
related as well. It's a lot that goes into it, but it's really heartbreaking to see that there's a lot of what you would say normal people, or what individuals that have a substance use disorder call other people that don't have one normies. Like I would be called a normie. Like, oh, Lindsay, you're a normie. It's interesting. Those normies that you would say, they still struggle with several things that they may be addicted to that may not be illegal, but they're addicted to it. So, yeah.
Do you see any kind of trend or correlation with addiction rising in today's society with social media or technology or things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question, really, because I don't know, like, and I'm sure you could agree with me because I mean I love social media. I'm on social media all the time to the point where I have to give myself a break. Like, okay, Lindsay, let's slow it down. But I think in the younger generation, like adolescent age right now, early 20s right now, they're using social media to identify who they are. And I think
Mm.
that's a big deal that we need to begin to talk more about because I'm afraid for this upcoming generation when they're in their 30s or when they're in their 50s of like not knowing who they really are because they've used social media to drive that. I think social media has several strengths and positives, but I think the negative could be like, oh, all these trends that you must keep up with, and if you don't, then you don't meet this certain type of deal. You know what I mean? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's a challenging part because I've seen a lot of adolescents, and I talk about this with my colleagues a lot about how it's like they find social media to be like, oh, I need to be this person, I need to look this particular way, and that increases the stigma. It just makes it harder to
Mm.
talk about if you're really struggling because people don't do that. I mean, that's just something you don't do, and then if you're supposed to look this way because of social media, it makes it even harder.
Certainly, and even in my own life, I will find myself on social media and seeing people at like parties or they're going on Vegas trips or boats or things like that, and I'm like, man, maybe I'm boring. Maybe like I need to drink more and have fun and do these things. And while drinking doesn't match up with my lifestyle choices or what I want to do, because I know that nothing good happens when I drink,
Uh,
nothing really positive happens to me. It's definitely glamorized on social media. Do you think that that affects people of a young age when they're seeing people on social media kind of partaking in any kind of substance use?
that is so true because I feel the same way too. Like, I'm like, am I boring? Because, like, I'm not like doing like out on a boat with like a Miller Lite in my hand. Like, am I boring?
Right.
And so yeah, it is. If I feel that way, and I believe to know that I have healthy coping skills, and I feel like I have healthy boundaries in my life, I can only imagine what adolescents are going through, or individuals in their early 20s at most, those who are in college or trying to identify what they want to do, and then they're scrolling and seeing people on these vacations or out with their fraternity or sorority. It's like I think it increases like if you do have a problem, you're just not there. Even more, you're not going to talk about it because you're trying to be this certain way. And then what I see is when I'm meeting these women at 30 years old, 40 years old, 50 years old, they're like, I never talked about it, Miss Lindsay. I never talked about it. And not in my
Hmm.
20s because I was trying to be this way. Not in my 30s because I was trying to be this way until my life came crashing down in my 40s or in my 50s. And anytime I'm with a individual that expresses to me that they have an addiction or a substance use disorder in their 20s, I always praise them. I'm like, you know what? Like, you should be so proud of yourself for talking about this because we can catch this early on. You don't have to lose all of your
Hmm.
children at 40. You don't have to start all over at 50. We can catch this in your 20s, and it's going to be probably 10 times harder because we are influenced by the media. We are influenced by our other peers who have 4-year universities or whatever. But let's work on this now. You don't want to be, I always tell them, do you want to be 50 years old still using this or still drinking excessively? And they're like, no. And I'm like, that's why we're here to talk about it because I don't want you to be 50 and walking around and you've lost everything. It's easier to start over at 22 than 55. So, yeah.
For sure. Yeah, I can definitely see that, especially with such a lifetime of use. I'm sure that's so hard to break mentally, like you're talking about withdrawals or just kind of this big secret that they're holding. What are kind of things that are stopping people from speaking out about their substance abuse or seeking help for it? Outside of the stigma, is there anything else that is kind of blocking them from being like, okay, I really need to approach this in a different way?
Sure, I think that the stigma creates lack of resources.
Mm.
Being in Dallas, Texas, we do have resources, but I recently went on a trip with some friends to Seattle, and we were walking around in the evening. We had just got done with dinner, and we were walking to our Airbnb, and I see a whole strip, and this is near like the Harborview Medical Center area, a whole strip of recovery help. It was addiction help. Like it literally said, just walk in these doors. And to me, I think that they have the resources. And, anyways, I was talking to one of my friends who is a nurse there, and she was like, "Oh, yeah, Lindsay, like they have so much resources here. If they're using any type of substance, marijuana, fentanyl, alcohol, like there's so many resources for addiction here in Seattle." And I'm like, man, like it's not like that here in Texas. At least in my personal experience thus far, I have not seen that. I'm over here searching and losing sleep for resources. How can I help my client that needs XYZ in this specific area? So, what I'm trying to say is that the stigma bleeds into everything else. And there's so much lack of resources, in particular for pregnant women that are using substances. I mean, that is a really big issue, and everyone's like, why would you keep doing that? You're pregnant, you have a baby inside of you. There's lots of lack of resources there. And also adolescents who are using, they believe that they should just be in juvenile or they're on their way to jail. So it's the stigma that it trickles down, and there's no
Mm.
opening of resources. So people who are in that trapped of addiction, they're like, why should I get help? There's no help for me.
Right.
And if I do reach out for help, it's a whole deal. So it's like it literally is a trickle down effect, that it's so unfortunate because that one person who reaches out for that help, they just need someone to listen and say, okay, we're going to find somewhere to help you. It may not be right here, but we'll work it out, kind of thing. So it's a lack of resources, I believe.
Do you see these substance abuse issues happening to a certain demographic more than others?
Uh, I mean, not necessarily. But I will say that the ones who reach out, yes. For example, here in the community that I serve, I think we see around 16% of Hispanics that reach out in the Latinx community. And I know for a fact there's so much more than that. They just don't reach out. It's just a cultural thing. They're not going to talk about it, they're not going to share that they're struggling. And we do serve a lot more of the Caucasian community here in North Texas. But I believe because they have access to the resources, or in their culture, they want to find access to the resources. And in like the African American culture, the Hispanic culture, it's a little bit more on the down low. But I do know that there are still some struggling for a fact. They just are not going to reach out. But I think it's pretty widespread, in my opinion.
Mm.
Yeah.
When with the women that you're working with substance abuse, what does your work kind of look like? What is the basis of what you are accomplishing with them? Obviously, I imagine it's sobriety, but what does that kind of work look like? What goes into that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question because, like, for example, a lot of, and I'm glad that we're talking about this because a lot of people want to just focus on the sobriety or the recovery. But what I try to tell my team and the clients that we serve and just the community is that it's so much more than just not drinking or not using the drug.
Mhm.
And I like to call it recovery capital, which is like your housing, your safe people, your job, money. Like, what does your capital look like? I always tell them it's like you're building a little city all by yourself, and it's all about your recovery. What does that look like? So my job is to not only teach my team, but also do it myself of like, okay, they're not using meth anymore, but where are they living? Oh, well, they're still in the shelter. Okay, how can we remove this barrier to get them a full time job? How can we teach them how to write a resume? How can we teach them how to, stay consistent at their 9 to 5? Or how can we teach them how to pay a bill on time or get the driver's license or buy a used car? It's all about living a self-directed life that you totally lose in active addiction. That's like non-existent. So my job is to come in here and say, you can do this. Recovery is possible, but it's so much more than not picking up that first drink or that glass of wine. It's about what are you doing with your life now that you're not drinking from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep. And usually that creates a spark in their eyes. They're like, oh my gosh, someone actually cares that I'm not just not drinking. Like someone wants to help me get a job. And it doesn't matter if it's at Sonic and it's just starting you out with, paying your bills and XYZ. So we're really dedicated to removing barriers and building a recovery capital with them. And that could be, like I said, plenty of different ideas for them to choose from or to gather. But our day looks like lots of crisis intervention, and also lots of assessing and intervening of like, okay, for example, this morning I got a phone call of an individual needing somewhere to go. She's like, I have nowhere to go. I'm not using anymore. I just have nowhere to go. And we see this a lot because in their active addiction, they lost everything, lost all the money in their account. So it's like they're building from nothing. And we understand that and we help them gather safe things in their toolbox to build it up.
That must be such life changing to know that somebody cares about you and your issues to the core.
Yeah.
Not like you're saying, just don't pick up the bottle, or I can't help you unless you just stop drinking or taking this or whatever. But to know that somebody's here, like, hey, I'll take you, or I'll find a ride to the job interview, or we can kind of role play tactics to work with, a new team or things like
Yeah.
that. I think that must be incredibly life changing and so impactful to know that people care so much. Because in my time in nursing school, I had a unit at a like recovery unit, and it was just so sad to see the lack of support that those individuals had. While I'm sure that the people and their families, it always sounded like they kind of ran through all of their possibilities with that person, their last chances kind of thing. They didn't have anything else, and it's like, how do you get better when you don't have that anymore?
Mm, mm. Yeah. And the hopelessness is what we see a lot. It's like
Mm.
and honestly, I probably feel the same way, too. Like if I think about my life right now and I'm like, okay, I have a car, I have a house, I have a family, I have a significant other, a really caring partner, I have a job, I know how to pay my bills, I have clothes, I think about all these things, and I imagine if I lost everything and ended up in a rehab, I would feel hopeless too. I would be like, well, where do I even start if I don't have anything anymore? Um,
Yeah.
and really, I try my absolute best to empathize with them and encourage them. Like, I totally get it. I would be hopeless too, but don't worry. We're going to get started from scratch, from square one. Like, tell me about what did you do before your active addiction? Some may be like, well, I
Mm.
started using when I was 12. I didn't do nothing. Okay, well, let's see if we can get you a GED. Let's see if we can start there. Or even some basic skills classes on how to use Microsoft, how to use Excel, how to write a resume, how to write a story, how to utilize daily life stuff, how to ride the bus, how to drive a car. Um, and, going back is the trauma correlates to the addiction. So
Mm.
it's 10 times more heartbreaking when they started using due to severe trauma that happened when they were 5 years old, started using when they were an adolescent, and then now they're 40 and they're like, I really know nothing else besides this. It's hard.
Wow.
Yeah.
Does the addiction that you see often kind of strip them of their identity in a way? Do they kind of lose themselves generally to a point where they have to completely start over?
Absolutely. Absolutely, because they find their identity in that drug of choice. And
Mm.
honestly, the disease begins to almost trap them, and it's like, this is who you are. And then on top of that, their family members, their exes, their friends, their children, they're done with them because they even identify alcohol with their mom or their daughter or their wife. So imagine if someone identified alcohol with me, they think about Lindsay and they're like, oh, alcohol. Like, that would be terrible.
Mm.
It's like I wouldn't want anyone to identify me that way, but the disease has it trapped so much that it does. It's like starting all over about who you are, what you're into. I like to do even personality tests with my clients. Like, let's just take a personality test. Like, what are you into? What's your favorite movie? What's your favorite color? I don't know. What do you like, video games? Like, just really asking them, like, just tell me. And they're like, I don't know what I like. Do you think you'll like that? Like, let's play a game right now. Let's see if you like it.
Wow.
So really try to help them find themselves. And I really also try to be vulnerable with them and say, it may look like I have it all figured out, but I definitely don't. And I'm also still
Mm.
learning about myself too, and what I'm into and what I like and what I don't like. And really just kind of remove that stigma too.